And let me thank the Adirondack Council for once again sponsoring this event, along with the Paul Smith College Center for Sustainability. So we only have one left after today. That'll be Julie Boren on Thursday at 6:30. And I'm really grateful, honored to introduce our speaker today. And it's also refreshing because there is no PowerPoint. It's nice to see some of that comes in and just talks with all of us. And I started up here or moved back to the Adirondacks about the same time that Brian came here, working at NCPR at the college here, right? Your initial office was here.
Yeah, my first office was just down the road. Yeah.
So for much of my time as a forest ranger, overlapped with Brian at NCPR, and I saw Brian covering many of the incidents that I was on, and Brian interviewed me a few times over the years as a ranger, and I did some time as a union delegate, and I was interviewed obviously by many reporters in the area, and I will admit, I'm always very comfortable talking to people, but I was always a little more nervous talking to Brian after, and I don't know what it was because you're always obviously very friendly, but I have to say, several times after we talked and you interviewed me, I have to say, oh my God, I blew that. I don't want to hear the report, I don't want to see it. And I think that just, a lot of it just happened to be from your professionalism and your stature reporting to this area. And it's been wonderful to see you, listen to you move on to NPR. And we've enjoyed hearing your reporting over these decades. And the last thing I'll say before I turn the mic over is, if you've heard Brian's postcards over the years, you knew I was going to say this, I'm sure. As a ranger on rescues, we were all NCPR listeners. And Brian did these postcards from mountaintops, and they're amazing. They give the listener a good idea of what they go through. But he often, he would be recording while he's, having a little, catching breath and stuff. So we used to, on our carryouts, the rangers and the high peaks, we used to kind of mimic and do like an impromptu Brian Mann reporting of the carryout. And we used to say our names, or sometimes Brian said, "This is Brian Mann, carrying someone off Marcy today. And it's cold, and it's windy." Because on those carryouts, you'd have to, you have to pass the time. And Brian, it was, you provided that for us, and they probably didn't know you were doing that, but thank you so much for that. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Brian.
So I'm going to test just talking. How about in the back? Can you hear me? That's a thumbs up. Great. And this won't mess up your recording, will it? No. Okay. Great. I do want to say I've been teased many times for my panting breath as I climb mountains and record them into the microphone for these audio postcards. And just this week, Emily Russell, who's taken over as the Adirondack reporter for North Country Public Radio, did a sweet little postcard from over in Wilmington. And as she's climbing up this steep pitch, you can hear her. She's 25 years younger than me, and she was panting as loudly as I ever do. So I felt very reassured by the fact that tradition of gasping your love of the Adirondacks into the microphone is continuing. And I will say that while Scott has occasionally teased me about my panting, I have been in many hiking groups where we've gotten exhausted and somebody in the group has said, let's just sit down and have Scott come rescue us. We're just going to stay right here until Scott comes and carries us out or brings the helicopter. And I am proud to say that never once, I've had to take shelter occasionally. At one time, actually, in the Forest Ranger Interior Outpost at Lake Colden. Got warmed up in the cabin once after a disastrous trip, but other than that, I've never needed to be rescued, so I'm hoping to keep that tradition alive. Well, and thank you to Paul Smith College and the Adirondack Council for having me, and of course to Scott. I love that he's made this transition here. I've just made this remarkable kind of career transition in my 50s to something new. Scott's younger than me, but he's still doing something kind of new and exciting, and I think that's really, really great. And the Vic certainly is a place that I've always used, and I'm glad that it's in exciting new leadership. In addition to hearing me, can you actually see me with this light? am I visible? Okay, great. It feels a little bit dim, but thank you all for coming. It's beautiful outside, and so you're making a great sacrifice to come in and be out of the wonderful sun. Here's what I want to do. I want to talk for about half the time that we have together, and I'm going to throw out a series of ideas, and some of them may be a little teeny bit deliberately provocative. And my hope is that you will all be thinking and reacting in your mind and kind of having your own questions, your own pushback, and that we will have a conversation. Whenever I do talks like this, the fun part for me is the conversational part. So spoil me and indulge me in as I go forward. Do be thinking, I want to raise my hand and I want to throw some ideas back at Brian. So let me talk first just a teeny bit about my journey, and then I want to talk really mostly about the stories that I covered in the park, the way those stories evolved, and some of my takeaways, some of my analysis of what this momentous period of history in the park has meant, where that puts us now, and what might come next. And one of the really interesting kind of fun moments for any of you who are people who follow the park closely, you may know that this last week, Governor Hochul appointed John Ernst to be the new chair of the Adirondack Park Agency. The park agency has been without leadership for a very long time, which I think is a symbolic kind of reality of the park. It has felt rudderless for a while, and I want to talk about that. It has been literally leaderless for a period of time. And so in throwing out some ideas here, I think maybe it's at a moment when the conversation about the park can be maybe revitalized and some fresh energy thrown in. So let me start by talking a little bit about how I got here. Over 20 years ago, I was living in the Midwest. I was a home parent raising a little baby boy. And I had been out of public radio for several years, and my wife at the time decided she wanted to turn being home with our son. And so she said, you have to go get a job. And I had grown up in Alaska, which we knew that was a little too remote for us. But I said, if I'm going to be back in public radio, I want to be north again. I want to be somewhere where there are mountains and there's winter. And, it was really a dream of mine to be back someplace that felt Alaska-ish, if not quite fully Alaska. And so I spammed news departments across the US-Canada border with applications and with resumes. And in one of those really miraculous moments in your life, like things that you will look back on, when you get married, the birth of your kid, there was just this wonderful thing that happened that North Country Public Radio and Paul Smith's College had partnered up to bring a public radio reporter into the park, to hire someone for the first time who would really think about this place and live in this place. And my application landed on their desk, and because I was this very non-traditional candidate, I don't have a college degree, I had been out of reporting for a long time, I was a home parent, a lot of these other newsrooms had no interest in me. And the folks here in the North Country were curious about some of my background and some of the things that I'd said about the kind of storytelling I like to do, so they flew me out. And I can still remember seeing the Adirondacks for the very first time. And unlike Scott, I had no history here. I truly did not know what the Adirondacks were. I've told people over the years that I think maybe I could say what an Adirondack chair was, but I actually don't think that's true. I don't think I could have told you what an Adirondack chair was. And so when I came to the region for my job interview, the two things that I remember super vividly is one, that the film Lake Placid was screening at the time, where there's a monster alligator in the North Woods, and I was like, wow, I don't get how that fits together. And the other thing was, we just drove through the park, and it was just this turn after turn revelation. And whenever we would park and hike a little bit, it was just this revelation. And I experienced what people sometimes talk about as a convert's passion. Like, I had nothing to kind of connect the dots here, and I just realized right away I really want to be in this place. And to my infinite delight, North Country Public Radio did decide to hire me and to bring me in, and we settled for many years in Saranac Lake, and this place really became for me sacred ground, in a way that I think about a lot. I've experienced many of the greatest highs that a man can have in his life here. The joys of this place are beyond anything that I've experienced anyplace else. And I will also say that, like any life, my life has had very hard chapters. Very difficult things have happened along my journey. And the Adirondacks as a landscape, people often talk about the healing quality, the history in Saranac Lake and other places of people coming here to regroup and rebuild. And this place has felt that way as well for me. And so when I pivot in just a second to talk about slightly more wonky stuff, I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that one of the things that I do think about here, even when I'm talking about policy or politics or, numbers on a page, beneath that is a sense that I have that this place matters in a profound way. It's a really important landscape to me personally, and I think in many ways to the world. And then I'll just say as a tiny footnote, in the last couple of years I have, as Scott alluded to, and maybe some of you have heard, I've made this transition to NPR to work on addiction issues and covering how drug addiction and drug policy are affecting Americans. And I do want to just say, so that it doesn't seem totally incongruous, that what got me to that place was covering the prison industrial complex in the park, right? We, in this way that I did not understand for many years, while we are this beautiful healing landscape on the one hand, we are also a landscape where a primary driver of the economy and of jobs and of livelihoods here, we think it's all tourism, we think it's leaf peepers and the environment, and this is reduced dramatically in recent years, but still to an enormous degree. When you drive through Saranac Lake, what you're seeing is an economy that is bolstered to an enormous degree by prisons in the same way that it's bolstered by universities and by the environment. And what I realized was that a lot of what was happening in the Adirondacks was because of drug war policies, that we were incarcerating a lot of people, especially people of color, and shipping them north into this landscape. And I really wanted to understand that, the morality of it, the policy of it, and that work, rooted very much right here in the park, eventually led to this other project that I'm working on now. If anybody has more questions about that drug policy stuff, I'm glad to go into it more in the question series. But I just wanted to reference that what I've gone on to do in this funky new chapter of my life is still very much rooted in the work that I was able to do here for North Country Public Radio. So let me talk now this next little bit, and again, remember, questions that's the coin of the realm here. Be ready to pop in. I want to talk about the Adirondack Park and give you my sense after these 20 years of really doing a deep dive into this place. I want to tell you kind of what I think I saw, and again, I want to say a few things that I hope will spark some thinking, and I want to tell you maybe where some interesting opportunities could arise now. First of all, I want to frame the park in a way that if I thought this place mattered 20 years ago, in this moment of climate change policy and thinking about this climate crisis that we've entered now, I think the Adirondack Park as a laboratory and a human experiment cannot be overstated. You cannot overstate the importance of a place where for now over a century we've been experimenting with what it means to rethink the balance between human communities and the natural rewilded community, right? How do you make that work? How do you take human populations, not push them out? Remember, there's a very efficient way to protect landscape scale ecologies, and that's to get the people out. And that's been often the model that's been used around the world. You go to many of our national parks, they've been purged of people, and it's super efficient. Once you do that, all you have to worry about is tourists, right? People coming for a day, coming to camp, that's your problem. Here, early on, for a variety of reasons, that model was not followed. And in this revolutionary way, we began to play with the idea of what do you do when you accept the idea that humans are going to be on this planet? and how do we keep a natural ecosystem intact? How do we live in some kind of balance? Obviously, originally the idea had nothing to do with climate, but all of this work, I think, brings us to a place where if this experiment can be thought of in the proper way, I think that along with lots of other experiments around the world, this can be one that really matters a lot. And I'll circle back to that kind of before we go to questions and just kind of tie that up. The first amazing thing that I want to say about this, and this is a problem I think that journalists like myself and many historians and many environmentalists and other leaders, the first thing that I want to say that is maybe a teeny bit provocative is that the untold story of the Adirondacks in this context is, and I'm talking specifically about the last 20 years now, is the enormous success of this place, right? As a journalist, what I've seen in the last 20 years is that much of our public and civic culture, especially around issues of the environment, has become more and more toxic, more and more vitriolic, more and more zero-sum game. Like, there was a time, 50, 60 years ago, when you could get Republicans and Democrats at the table to talk about the environment, whether it was the ozone layer or acid rain or lots of other issues, there was a political center. On the national scale now, to an enormous extent, that has imploded. It's a disaster. But here in the park, in this absolutely mysterious way, over the last 20 years, we have seen massive gains in preserving wilderness, in solving problems, not completely, but to an enormous extent of things like acid rain. This park, compared to when I arrived, which is a blink of the eye ago, this park has a much more integrated, intact ecosystem, on a scale that is monumental. And that work was accomplished over a period of time when the level of conflict declined. When I got here in the late 90s, people were still talking about, very recently, the era when people carried firearms and when they set buildings on fire and when they dumped manure on each other's doorsteps, right? It was bad. And as I reported initially, I would still encounter a lot of the things that we talk about today: false news, conspiracy theories, lies about the other side. I can remember talking to people on both sides, the environmental community and local government pro-development side, and they would tell me that they had to meet in secret to talk about compromises and issues, because if their constituencies knew they were talking, it would blow up the conversation. It was that toxic, it was that polarized. And so over the course of 2 decades, while the rest of the culture was moving towards Donald Trump and January 6th and truly a disintegration, the Adirondack Park moved in the entirely opposite direction. And one of the things that I think journalists like myself and many others who talk about the park, because we're so addicted to the conflict narrative, Phil Terry, the great Adirondack historian, calls this contested terrain. And obviously there's truth to that. This is a place where different interests are always going to push back. But one of the things that I want to really push into the conversation is the contested part, I think, is no longer the big takeaway. The thing that people should think about when they look at the park is, holy crap, how did they just do that? How did they just do the Finch-Prine land deal, this massive thing on a scale that is, really unheard of, without people blowing each other up and tearing each other apart? The other thing that I think is really problematic often about the park's discussion is that as we have solved many of these huge problems, and let me just say a footnote to explain what I mean. When I came here, the park was sitting on essentially a ticking bomb, right? And what that ticking bomb was that the timber companies still owned massive scales of commercial land, right? So there was all this beautiful countryside, and some of it was private, some of it was public, but right in the middle of it there were these vast expanses of timberlands that these companies didn't really want to own anymore. And there was a real threat that those would be subdivided and turned into ticky-tacky vacation homes, whatever. It was a real possibility. It would have changed, altered fundamentally forever the character of the park. So nobody knew how that would get solved. 20 years later, to an enormous extent, let's say to 95%, it is solved. That land is no longer available for development. It's either in the forest preserve or it's covered by conservation easements that put it beyond that kind of development. So we've solved those major problems. And despite that success, weirdly, the narrative remains fixated on tiny little flashpoints. Like, we continue to talk about the park too often. And again, I raise my hand being guilty of some of this as a reporter. We continue to talk about this place often like things are on fire. And I think that we need to be disciplined about this. And let me give you one example of this. This might be, for some of you, might be a little bit controversial. A place where I fell into this trap, where for a decade, we howled at each other over the rail trail debate, right? Is this rail trail going to be a multi-use path? Is it going to be a tourism train? Is it going to be a little of both? And again, I had people come to me and with conspiracy theories, lies. I was on the take. I was being corrupted by people. And finally, you know, and I keep my cool as well as any reporter. I would occasionally turn to people and say, "You think I would sell out all of my journalistic history and integrity over a rail trail? That's the thing that you think I would be in the tank for?" And they would say, "Oh yes," because to them it had inflated in their minds. And what I would occasionally say to people is, if I have a bias, I think you're both exaggerating how important this is. I don't think a rail trail is going to transform the Tri-Lakes into some kind of mecca. I also don't think a tourism train would translate, you know, into that kind of thing. And yet there is this instinct, whether it's overuse of trails, whether it's the rail trail, all of these issues which matter. I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be at the table talking and solving and looking for ways to move forward. But I think oftentimes, for a laundry list of reasons, having tackled those enormous issues over this last 20 years and done it in a way that I think those people who did it, you know, deserve medals. I think we've fallen into a pattern where we keep getting preoccupied by fairly trivial issues. So that brings us now to 2021. In my estimation as a journalist covering these stories, what would I point to as the part of this experiment that hasn't worked, right? If it's not about rail trails and it's not even about overuse of hiking trails, all of which matter, but I don't think they're, you know, on the grand scale matter, where does the experiment of the Adirondack Park break down? I would argue that it is the human communities. What I've seen at the same time that over 20 years I watched the park being protected to an almost unbelievable degree, ecologically, at landscape scale. At the same time, over those 20 years, I observed and reported on and documented demographic decline of catastrophic proportions. You know, the aging and the dwindling and the shrinking of these human communities. Now, I want to say something very quickly here, and there's a great environmentalist in the park, Peter Bauer, who will call me on this very quickly if I don't say this out loud. I do not think the Adirondack Park is making it worse. Much of rural America is going through the same demographic problem, right? Rural America, especially rural white America, is aging and dwindling in population at a level that is verging on science fiction. I mean, it is really crazy what we're seeing, you know, with the exception of a very few pockets of the country. Small town America is in real trouble. What's interesting about the Adirondack Park, and I've poked at this a number of times in my reporting, I've talked about it with some of the policymakers in the park, is that I think that we have the opportunity here with the park agency, with the NGOs that exist here, with the intellectual capital that exists here, to try to do better. So again, I want to be clear, my reporting does not suggest that the park is making these small towns worse. However, what is also clear factually is that this experiment is not making small towns much, if any, better. And so as a model, as an exportable, braggable model like one that we could take to the world and say, look, if you do this, it has all of this cornucopia of benefits. We can say this is a great way to preserve land. We can say it's a great way to create habitat. But we cannot go right now to China or Indonesia or the Midwest and say it is also a thing that after 20 years, your small towns are going to be bubbling with vitality. They're going to be going strong because you bought in. And for this to be one of the solutions to this larger global question, how do we all live in balance? Half of this experiment working is not going to be enough. You won't be able to go to people and say, hey, it was an awesome way to protect the high peaks. There are lots of awesome ways to protect a mountain range. Again, you can just kick all the people out. It's super simple. But if you're going to keep the people there, and if you're going to say that's part of the experiment, then you have to also sharpen your pencil on that piece. And I fear that, I'm 56 now, and I've been watching the park now for a little over 20 years. I see the erosions in many parts of the North Country at a really nervous tipping point, where things that we had talked about, schools closing, fire departments not being able to get enough volunteers to provide basic services, ambulance crews that don't respond because there are no people to man or people the ambulances. Those things are starting to hit a critical mass. My little town where I live is in the process of shutting down its school, right? And when you get to the point where you don't have enough people or enough children to just simply replenish your population, you have real questions to be asked. Which brings me to the Adirondack Park Agency. One of the things that's interesting to me about the Adirondack Park Agency, people have been talking for the last 5 or 6 years about how it has really faded back as an institution that is doing key important things in the park. It's been without a leader. A lot of its meetings have become very pro forma, just kind of moving permit processes along. And I want to make the argument that having watched the park agency over 20 years, that is not what it was meant to do. The park agency was created to think, to be a policy place where it looked at the Adirondack Park and thought about what this place can or should or might be. And if many of its original mission statements have been, to a substantive degree, and I don't want to overstate it, there are still always going to be land disputes and that sort of thing, but if a lot of those have been reckoned with, all that commercial timberland is now protected and other big decisions have been made. One of the things that I hope we will see is the leaders of the park agency asking some of these larger questions. What can we do to think about this experiment going forward? What are the biggest challenges here for this park that we might participate in and address over time? And I think the same question could be put to a lot of the NGOs that operate in the park. If you've protected X amount of land and X amount of ecosystems, what kind of thinking can be done about the human communities that are here? How can those same levels of collaboration, innovation, risk-taking, big risk-taking, how can that be done in a way that we go into a little town and we say, let's see if we, let me provide you sort of a visual metaphor. In 1910, you could drive through the Adirondacks and a lot of it looked like a nuclear bomb went off. I mean, it looks nothing like it does today because it has been rewilded and restored. So it would be really interesting to me if people would say, let's think that ambitiously about rural human communities. How can we think that if somebody came here in 2021, in many of these towns, they would see roughly the equivalent of, it's empty, but we would like to restore it to some level of sustainable ecosystem, sustainable human ecosystem. And the policy questions that could be asked there while maintaining the forever wild, balance would be really interesting. Again, this is not a conversation as a journalist that I would be interested in seeing just with the Empire State Development Authority or the bankers. I don't want to only say, how can we flush a bunch of money into the system? The question is, how do you keep the original experiment in your spirit, in your mind, while also saying, we would like there to be a future for the human side of this equation. And let me just kind of continue this narrative arc by giving you one example. As we try to think about the human side of the ecosystem in the park, there's one particular policy conversation that I've always wanted all of us to have in a really different way. And this is very in the weeds and very wonky, but it's just an example of, I think, a conversation that could really be a game changer. It turns out that when the park was created in this way, one of the original social contracts, a lot of people don't realize this, that occurred, was that the state of New York agreed to keep paying property taxes on all the land that it owns up here, right? How many people know this? Right, so you guys know that this is a reality, that every year a check gets written to this school district and this county and all of the people that would normally collect taxes from you or me for owning a chunk of land, the state writes them a check too. And it's a lot of money. It's a huge amount of money that flows into the park every year, right? Only because of this peculiar system that we created, and let me just say, there's no absolute statutory reason why the state of New York even has to do that. It's a social contract. It's a deal which I think is absolutely appropriate. We're going to wild a lot of the land around you, and in exchange there's going to be this trade-off, this compensation, if you will. That part I think makes perfect sense. The question is that going to the right places? Is it doing the right things? So right now, we're distributing all of that money based on acreage, right? It has nothing to do with where the human communities are. So think about that for a second. There is a huge pipeline of investment capital, of dollars that could incentivize young families, that could be building broadband, that could be doing I don't even know what all the interesting experiments are, but there is this vast resource that happens not one year. It's not a thing of let's all compete for one grant. This pipeline is going to be there. It's really solid. And instead of it going to Tupper Lake or North Creek or a little town to say, okay, how can we do interesting things here? It goes to wherever there's empty forest, right? And as a journalist, it's nothing like my job to say how that money should be spent. But it is part of my job as a journalist and a storyteller to say, shouldn't we have a conversation about things like this? About all the different resources and all the different assumptions that are built into the park, how they are or are not serving those human communities. Right? So, and this is again a place where if the Adirondack Park Agency moved to a more centered place where it had some role, let's say, for example, I'm just going to make up a couple numbers here, but let's say that it's $50 million a year that gets paid. And let's say that we decided that instead of all of that just going out willy-nilly to whoever has the most trees, let's say 10% of that money every year goes to the Adirondack Park Agency to be a fund that is allocated based on interesting ideas, that's allocated based on what could revitalize community. And again, I'm not talking about let's preserve more trees here. I'm not saying $5 million more so that we can buy more land for the park. I'm saying, there's a role here to say, what can we do, right? And so this is the policy discussion that I think for the APA to be sort of revived from the place where it is right now. This is one tiny little idea that could get people thinking this is an institution that back in the 1970s was thinking big, risky ideas. And it worked. To a substantial degree, what began in the 1970s produced this amazing landscape that we're in 2021. And so if we can get back to a place where someone in the park is again saying, let's figure this out. Let's not assume that we have to die like the rest of rural America has to die. Let's assume that with some thinking and some strategic policy wonky behavior and some risk taking and collaboration, we could do that same kind of thing for the other side of the experiment. And I'm going to conclude by saying that again, my reason for arguing for this kind of hopeful, risky behavior is first, because I love this place and I want to live here and I want the people who come after me to be able to live here and have a fire department and have a hospital within a reasonable range. Like my little town, we lost our grocery store last year. It was a teeny little grocery store. It wasn't a big grocery store, but it was a place where I could go get a few groceries. It's not there anymore, right? And that's not an isolated experience. That's really increasingly common. And so, and again, beyond my love for this place and my hope that there will be a similar renaissance that we've seen in the ecological world, in the human world, I do also, I'm going to end on the note about climate. I really do think that if we can close this circle, if we could get to a place in the next 20 years where the next reporter standing up here says, you know, this really works. There is a way that these things, you know, we can prove to you in the upper Midwest or in Florida or whatever, that this is a model where all of these systems can integrate in really, obviously everybody would tweak the dials a little differently, but this can really work. This could be one of all the different hopeful experiments and models around the country that I think could be part of pulling us back from the brink. And I will say, just one little footnote, when I talk to people about the future of the park now, even in terms of its ecology, the biggest threat to this place now is no longer anything that we have in our back pockets. It's climate, right? The thing that's going to get us here is climate. And so if at this point, if I'm an environmentalist and I'm thinking, what is the next chapter here? It's not going to be acid rain. It's not probably going to be like the big thing that's going to have a huge ecological impact on the park is not going to be whether, you know, the trail up Cascade is getting 1,000 people or 10,000 people. I mean, it sucks that it's getting 10,000 people, but on a landscape scale, that's not the thing that's going to really hurt this park. What's going to hurt this park is if somehow we don't contribute to this larger global reckoning. And I think we're positioned, I know this sounds maybe hopelessly idealistic, but I think we are positioned so that we can be part of that larger conversation. The experiment here is that important. It's been that successful if we can just kind of keep closing that circle. All right, so there's the sort of story I want to tell. That's sort of me giving you guys a download of what I think I saw here. Anybody have thoughts or questions, or you think I'm nutty or anything? I don't have my glasses on, so even if I know you, I'm just going to point at you.
Is that me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was really glad to hear you talk about the property tax policy, because that's something that I studied public administration years back and learned about property tax capitalization, and I think the amount of the subsidy is closer to $200 million a year.
Yeah.
For a population year-round of 130,000 people. That's a big influence on how things are structured, and it would be great to see more research and information about how that changes the real estate market. Does that have an effect on homelessness rates, and where affordable housing is in the park, and a whole other stream of sort of impacts, and is also affecting other budget priorities for the state. Is it moving money away from parkland management issues and things like that? So I think that's a great.
Let me just interrupt and then say the rest of your piece. But it's been a long time since I've looked at this number. And let me just say that when I tried to look at how much number every taxing jurisdiction in the Adirondacks is getting from the state of New York, in most cases for providing absolutely no services back, right? They don't do anything usually for the state of New York in return. So it's pure money, first of all, it was very hard to get those numbers. People were very reluctant to just say, here's how much we get every month, every year. The second thing that I will say is that what this contributes to is in a place like Hamilton County, which has a population of around 5,000 people, I think I counted 13 plus taxing jurisdictions like this. There are so many school districts, there are so many different entities that clearly still exist largely to get this money, right? And so think about, and again, I don't know what the exact number is right now, but it is a ton of money. And when you think about, like, what is it doing? Like, what, and I want to say, I did do enough reporting that I came away, I never quite nailed the story, but I want to say, I never felt like there was corruption. I never felt like the money was vanishing in a creepy way. But when I would talk to people, you would go into a little town and they would have a palatial highway department garage. And they would be like, oh we could never give up a penny of that money. How would we ever survive? And meanwhile, there are 4 golden shining new trucks sitting back in the garage behind them. So if you give people X tens of millions of dollars a year, every year, they're going to find ways to spend it. Whenever I would talk to really interesting, thoughtful people, and I'd say, is there any way that any of that money could be mobilized towards future planning or for incentivizing businesses or bringing young people here? I come from Alaska, and for a long time, Alaska had homesteader policies. Like, if you're a young person, they would find a way to get you land that you could homestead. And so there are all kinds of ways that if we looked at our demographics and said, here are the things we need people under the age of 30, and we need them, in these places. I mean, you could really do some fun thinking once you've freed up a teeny slice of that cash to think about it. I've always thought that was an intriguing thing, but I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Another one is a per capita spending by school districts per pupil.
Right.
In some of the school districts in the Adirondacks is among the highest in the state by a factor of 3 or 4.
Which is solely, one thing that is important to say is that in addition to all of this property tax money that fire hoses in, the Adirondacks most governments also are on the receiving end of huge influxes of other programs that infuse lots of cash. So this one piece of our, the money that gets spent, that's only one part of it.
But I think that's a policy issue, and if I recall correctly, a few years ago there was a state budget proposal to change it to a payment in lieu of taxes, which is what the federal government does for federally owned land. And the federal government also has caps on the per capita amount, so even if you have a lot of land, there's still a cap. And I understand it was principally proposed just to save the state money because the state has a workforce of foresters whose job is just to count the trees,
right,
to make sure the assessments are fair.
One thing that I will say, when I've talked about people with this whole series of issues before, one of the things that I've heard back from people very explicitly is, we can't talk about any of this because if people statewide realized what was going on, and if more legislators realized what was going on, the policy discussion could get out of hand very quickly. Like that payment in lieu of taxes thing was a real warning shot to people, and I understand that. I understand that there is fear in the park that if we had a conversation about what to do with these resources, the conversation could tilt very quickly toward, why are we doing this again? Why are we sending you all this money for no services in return? And I that's a very reasonable concern. And let me just say that as a proud Adirondacker, I do not support cutting off the funds. I think we should have a conversation about, like, long-term, what those funds, and lots of other resources, lots of other things that happen in the park. One thing that could happen with that money is, I know this is sort of a holy grail for a lot of people, it could be a new cadre of forest ranger type people. There are lots of ways that money could benefit, the things that we do here. I'll say one other thing is that, one of the things that I've always thought would be really interesting is if you had resources to think like this, another really interesting thing that you could start experimenting with is how to better monetize the traffic that we have here, right? Right now we don't have the resources to really think about that. We have a vast invasion of people every weekend. That's where everybody complains about them now. Oh, they're parking on all the sides. Well, those are, in theory, those people could be our customers. They could be our economy. And instead, because we don't really know what to do, like nobody's ever figured out, how do I get that license plate from Massachusetts or Quebec? How do we translate that into sustainable economy here? Well, if you had 2 more people at the park agency or someplace else thinking about these in policy terms, how do we do that? How do we translate that into sustainable economic activity, rather than just immediately deflecting to how can we stop them from coming, or how can we irritate them or make them put their dogs on leashes or whatever to get them cranky so they won't come. There might be some more interesting things to do there, and I would love to see the resourcing for that.
Brian, I'm glad you raised the issue of the park rangers. What's your analysis or opinion of why the Albany has resisted so strongly increasing the number of rangers? Class groups of troopers come in who are paid much more than the rangers, and the rangers are hardly replacing the retirements. Is there some sort of something I'm missing why they keep the number so low?
I don't have a strong conviction from my reporting about that. I think that there have been serious budget constraints. I think that there have been legitimate policy questions in Albany about how to prioritize different places. Obviously, the forest ranger crews here, from my reporting, are legitimately overworked and stressed. I think that's just, the facts are incontrovertible there. Sometimes the stress load is very intense. All of that said, and again, I want to be a little bit provocative here, I think that's one of the issues that is important. I don't want us to stop talking about that, but I think it's one of those things that it's every once in a while, as a journalist, I want to say, it's kind of like Cascade Trail. Like, it matters that Cascade is getting the crap beat out of it every weekend, but that's not the thing that's going to move the needle here. The thing that's going to move the needle is for us to keep taking the lens back and looking at the Adirondack Park in a more substantive way. And so let me just do an example of that. Rather than just being negative, let me be positive. If we were thinking about the resources that are coming into the park in a different way, it might be possible for communities that are committed to outdoor recreation as part of their economy to have some of their own people. Right? We already have seen the growth of the Summit Stewards and the Roadside Stewards program. That's been an enormous help. It's not the same as a forest ranger, but again, there are other possible, if we do some of these other things, there could be some other approaches. But to answer your question very simply, I've talked on background with lots of leaders in Albany. I think the rangers make them cranky sometimes because they're kind of the squeaky wheel. But I also think they kind of love the rangers, they really do, and they think they're cool guys and cool gals. And I think if they had all the money in the world, they would hire a bunch more of them. But I do think that it really often does come down to money. I think there's a lot of things to spend money on in New York. I will say, and this is me being a little bit ominous, but I remember when that elderly couple had that tragic experience on the Northway, and all of a sudden we got religion about cell phone towers.
Yes.
I have often thought that if we had a weekend where really bad things happen because we don't have enough forest rangers, that could spur change. However, and this is my journalist brain, I'm really curious about different things. Let me say one other really interesting thing. There's a really interesting policy debate to be had here over what the heck a ranger should be. I climb and do backcountry trekking all over the United States, and there are lots of places where people go missing all the time, and there are no rangers. That just, you don't expect it. You don't go there and think Scott is going to be out there for me, right? And I will say also, and Scott and I could probably, have 4 beers over this debate. I do see over the last 20 years that I've been here, I think there's a real story. Like somebody, Emily or somebody at the newspaper, somebody needs to dive in on this story. I think there's been some mission creep. I see you forest rangers out there with people who probably should be getting themselves out of the woods, and And maybe there's some great reason, again, as a reporter, that I would be asking a question. Did you need to go on that call? And a ranger might say, yes, absolutely. We vet it very carefully. Here's why we were there. It looks on paper like it was somebody who was a little bit lost, but in reality, we knew we needed to be there. But those are questions that around this forest ranger debate, I think there's some good reporting to be done there. But my hope is that we don't have a tragic event that is the tipping point there. Okay.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, how many years has this been on your mind and on your radar? And, you know, is it 10? Is it 2? Is
The
it...
community stuff?
Yeah.
Very shortly after I arrived in the park, I started to see trend lines that were scary. And I've written and thought about rural policy even before I came to the North Country. And so I knew that the North Country was part of this larger national pattern. And then I'll tell you, like, here's a personal story, kind of one of those laws of unintended consequences. Probably 12 years ago now, I wrote an article for Adirondack Life magazine about some of this stuff. And it got talked about quite a lot. It was something that I would go into policymakers' offices and I would see it sitting on their desks. And, you know, and what I will say with some remorse is that I feel like that article did get used by people who were basically just pro-development and basically within the state bureaucracy, what I felt like they started doing was trying to, this sounds arrogant, like I'm the reason that they did this, but I think maybe I was a tiny part of the reason that they did this, is that they started trying to bend lots of rules in the park to lean towards community development. And that's actually, I like your question because it allows me to say this. I don't want the Adirondack Park Agency or any other state agency to start trying to bend the rules a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more so that they can do something for North Creek or something for Tupper Lake. What I want them to do is think out loud, to have a policy conversation. Because first of all, those little bendings of the rules, like for example, there was this long drawn out thing where the DEC tried to come up with some argument where they could maybe do commercial camping on the forest preserve, where they could let people build yurts or things of this kind. And they really kept floating this trial balloon. And everybody knew it was probably never going to fit under, you know, the rules of the park. And there have been a couple of other instances like that where everybody's like, you know, why are you bending the rules in this way? It doesn't make much sense. And I also don't think it helps very much, you know. Like, let me give you an example. The big one recently was doing the connector trail for snowmobiles down in the central Adirondacks, Minerva and that area. It was part of the Finch Pine kind of back of the napkin land deal. And it was legally risky and it got caught up in the courts and the court shot it down. And that's an example of where they tried to shoehorn something in for the communities that the communities wanted and had a legitimate ask for, but instead of backing up and saying, let's have a real policy conversation, like how do we make all of this work? How do we do it front-brained and up front? Instead it was like, let's just try to make it go. And I would argue that even if they had pulled that off, even if that snowmobile connector trail had gotten built and they had, you know, had whatever, that's not on a scale that's really going to move the needle. Maybe snowmobile tourism moves the needle a teeny bit in some places, but it's not going to be the life or death difference. So like that article that I wrote, you know, 10 or 12 years ago, it got people talking a little bit more about how the park can balance these things, but instead of having a really muscular discussion and getting courageous about saying, how do we do this? Instead, I feel like it just got people kind of coloring outside the lines a little bit. And I felt some regret about that over time. Okay, so I've been thinking about it for a long time. That's the short answer to the question.
Since you moved here.
Yeah.
My second question is, what I think I'm hearing you say is, Adirondack, the APA is doing more, well, they're just doing permits and da-da-da-da-da. What is keeping them from looking more big picture and trying to do more with this situation?
The Adirondack Park Agency is the smallest agency in the state of New York. It's woefully underfunded. And it's always been, in theory, the APA is supposed to be apolitical, and there are supposed to be commissioners appointed who then have a term in office so that they're pretty untouchable and they can go do interesting things for the park that is nonpartisan and is not controlled from Albany. The realities of that have always been sketchy. There's always been political influence, and the governor has always had a lot to say about what the park agency does. Under Andrew Cuomo, it went way further. You know, just by leaving it without a permanent chair, it was impossible for that entity to really do strong things. There were also periods of time when the last chair was there, Lonnie Ulrich, who was, I believe, the last permanent chair. Am I right about that? Yeah. I watched Cuomo physically be in groups of people where he would delegitimize her, where he would include other people in the conversation while marginalizing. And I think it was deliberate. I think he wanted to control the Finch-Prine process. There was a lot of politics around the Big Tupper development process. So I think all of that pressure really wounded the agency and took a lot of its, you know, I think, without saying anything disrespectful about any person on the commission, I think there have also been very deliberate choices about who is on the panel. You know, when I came here, the people on the Adirondack Park Agency Commission were people who taught me an enormous amount about the park. They were thinkers, they were interesting folks. And, you know, I can't remember the last time that I watched an APA meeting where there was a ferment of ideas. You know, whether they were not even necessarily they're fighting over something. I just want to see that they're thinking about stuff. So, you know, in order to revitalize that agency, you would need a strong leader, somebody who's willing to tell the governor to back off, somebody who's willing to come in and say, I have some ideas, I have some vision. You would need to appoint people, not just one person. There's been this long tradition of having a Dick Booth on the panel, right? And again, no disrespect to the other people, but to have only one person who is deeply, deeply versed in land use policy, in community economic development, all these different things, that's not enough. You know, so and we'll see, you know, if Governor Hochul really wants the park agency to do interesting things, you know, we'll start seeing more of those signals. It's probably going to be, I'm probably being wildly optimistic that that's possible, but so all of those things have served, I think, to cripple it. And let me just say, and this is maybe the most, you know, some people in the room might really disagree with me, but I do think another thing that's taken the wind out of the sails of the APA is that a lot of its core original 1970s mission is kind of solved, right? Like that massive scale of private land that needed to be managed with private land use zoning, a lot of it is now under conservation easement or it's in the forest preserve. Not, again, I'm not saying that's all true. You know, we've got lots of areas that there's always going to be permitting decisions, always going to be that. But it is not like it was in the 1970s. It's not like it was in the 1990s. It's a whole different world now. And so I think, is it time for them to think big about what could our next mission be? Maybe. That could be an interesting conversation for them to at least float and talk about. Orange jacket.
Brian, would you talk more about the APA's mission regarding communities and human development?
I want to make sure I'm saying what I really know to be true. So the park agency has always had staff and has always had you know, many people on the commission who are focused on this. They have always had, the local government review board has always had a person on the panel who stays focused on community issues. When you look at the founding documents, there are, you know, arguments and ideas throughout. The private land use plan that does clearly give them the mission of thinking about the economy and about infrastructure those kinds of things. I would argue that the state constitution that includes the famous Forever Wild clause does also include enough language about human communities to make it clear that there was always the understanding that there would be these balances. Forever Wild is a very beautiful statement, but there's also stuff woven into the Constitution about things like dams and roads and reservoirs and other things like that. So, but let me say, I want to be very transparent. I think one of the most interesting things to do, if you wanted to have a conversation like this, would be to sit down and look at exactly what you're asking. What's in there now? And here would be an interesting question for a good reporter at the Adirondack Almanac or at the Explorer or somewhere else, is to say, okay, we often ask, is the APA and the DEC and the other entities, are they living up to the Forever Wild stuff? Are they doing that part to the degree that they're statutorily required? It would be interesting to go through those documents and say, here's what we sort of read it saying about communities. Are they doing that? And then you could ask, should there be changes to those rules and changes to their guidelines, changes to their mission? But it would be a really interesting story to just sort of say exactly what you just asked. What are they supposed to be doing? Are they doing it? Are they doing it effectively? How does that mix into their thinking? That it would be, and the clear takeaway that I want you to take from what I'm saying is I don't know the answer to that. I don't know chapter and verse on what they're actually being instructed to do and to the extent to which they're doing it well right now. You had your hand up.
Yeah, kind of from the glass is half full point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be just anecdotally, but the towns I see that have kind of recovered and getting their old mojo back, like
Yep.
North Creek 20 years ago was
Yep.
a disaster.
Yeah.
And it was just the people in town said, we've got to do something. It wasn't government, it wasn't the state, it wasn't local government, it was local businesses that kind of slowly brought it back. That hotel in the center of town, kind of from your point of view, I remember people literally saying it used to be a drug den.
Yeah.
Guy bought it, it's kind of the premier business in town now.
Yeah.
Tupper Lake, 10 years ago, was pretty bucolic. And it's just people in town that have decided to bring it back. So it's kind of a positive thing in small steps. A lot of the small businesses you see that have started up are those 30-year-olds that grew up here and they're energetic, so they went to college and were going to the big city and gonna make their way in life, and then realized after they've kind of gotten out of that young person's approach that where they came from was pretty nice, and they've come back and started a lot of small businesses. So there is positive things to be seen. It can't be all just a negative approach. I see a lot of that.
So let me speak to that. Can everybody hear? Okay. Let me say a couple things. One is, it's so important what you just said. The glass, there are really hopeful projects, and there's the kind of the young farmers movement close to where I live, which is pretty exciting, over around Essex and north to Keysville. Saranac Lake is its own really unique laboratory of lots of different things happening with cool energy, and so I love that you've given me the opportunity to kind of correct the framing of the narrative. I do not want anybody to think I think I might have compared communities to the scorched earth in the 1910s. Okay, I'm really glad you didn't let me walk out of here leaving that be the metaphor, because that's clearly not true. Now I want to say something where I really want to push back hard, because there's a romanticism in what you just said that I think we've got to be honest with ourselves about. Government is everything in the Adirondacks. And every time anybody pretends that it's bootstraps and me with my chainsaw, when you look at the economics of this place, there is almost no private capital investment anywhere in rural America, certainly not in the North Country. So and the only reason I push back is this: it's very important for people to be brutally honest about what has moved the needle. When you look at Tupper Lake, when you look at Saranac Lake, when you look at North Creek, yes, there are some business people who are doing cool things. God bless them. But the thing that has transformed downtown Tupper Lake is a per capita investment of government taxpayer money taxed on somebody far away from here that is colossal. You look at Saranac Lake is probably one of our most sustainable towns. And the amount of government money flowing into Saranac Lake in an annual season is crazy. And so it's really, and I say all of this because it's really crucial that we be honest with ourselves. There is, and this is again, I'm going to put the Adirondacks aside. There is a mythology in rural white America that we do it. Everybody else is government dependent, we do it. And it is a devastatingly misleading fiction. The reality is that if you pulled government out of any rural county in America, I come from Alaska originally. If you pulled government out of Alaska, you literally would shut the whole state down. It would stop. It would cease to exist. And in every rural county in the country, and I don't say this just to bludgeon people. I don't say it just to make them feel bad about the fact that even if they vote really conservative Republican, the truth is that they also live in what a lot of policy people call rural socialism, because it really is to that degree of government infusion of cash. We have to be clear-eyed with ourselves, not to mock ourselves or to feel bad about ourselves, but to understand the work that lies ahead. I mean, I would love it if at some point in the future, the Adirondack Park would be a self-sufficient, totally, we really did it for ourselves. But the years of work that lie between where we are now and that moment, that's a monumental task. So yes, there's a lot of cool stuff going on. Yes, some of it's small business owners, people with spunk, 30-somethings. But when you look at the macroeconomics of the Adirondack Park, we live, breathe, or don't live and don't breathe on checks from Albany and checks from Washington, D.C. And that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. Out the door. Okay, you want to right there?
Hi. You just touched on this with one word, broadband.
Okay.
But you didn't go into much detail. I do work with the National Rural Co-op, Electric Co-op Association. And one thing we've been putting a lot of focus on is piggybacking to get broadband to people's homes.
Yeah.
On the electric wires. And a lot of time to unwind, federal government, state government, and so forth to make that happen. But it impacts communities, schools, libraries, ability to have a workforce that's connected. And we've sort of seen this in the last 2 years with so many people, escaping metropolitan areas wanting to come up here, but that connectivity is what made it possible. And I just wonder if you thought more about the impact of really putting focus on could money be diverted to create these kinds of opportunities by getting people connected so they can work in a more remote location.
Yeah.
And that's it.
It's a really good question, broadband, and I will tell you all that I'm going home to Westport tonight. I spent the night last night up in the St. Lawrence Valley, and while I was away, my local exchange was installing my fiber optic. So in theory, assuming it works, I'm going home to like super fast internet. So I'm gonna watch movies the rest of the weekend. But okay, so let me say something about broadband. First of all, it's essential. It's like having a road to your town. If you don't have the road to your town, nothing else works. And I think there is a ton of policy work being done on it. That last mile issue is one that everybody's wrestling with, and I think there's some pretty good ferment and some good interest there. Now let me pivot and talk about, I'm going to just totally take advantage of you, and I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about, which is that this is one of the areas of policy where I want people to think in three-dimensional ways and have the resources to do it. And here's what I mean. What we now know is that broadband is not enough. That's not enough. You're not going to get 30-somethings to go live in Newcomb just because they have broadband, right? They're not going to bring their babies and their investments and their work just because there's broadband. So what you want to do is you want to think about like, okay, that's an essential tool, but we also want to bundle it with other things about like how do you actually recruit telecommuters? How do you set up a package of incentives and like marketing. How do you say, like, let me just role play a scenario. Let's say that there's an investment fund for telecommuter recruitment, that different towns can come up with their plans. And what you would say is, first of all, you'll have broadband. Second of all, we have this whole little marketing packages that shows we have an amazing school. We have reasonably low property taxes. Housing is affordable. There's a cool little coffee shop. There's, a tavern that you can, brew pub. I mean, it can't be just one thing. Well, that's what we now know. Even in places where there is broadband, young people are like, I want to be in Brooklyn. I don't want to be alone up there in the snow all year. I want to be somewhere where I am going to meet a cute guy, and I'm going to start a family, and here's an example. Years ago, you asked how long I've been thinking about this. I would go in and be talking to policymakers, and they would be talking about how they were cutting their school budgets, maybe even getting rid of their schools altogether. But they were cutting their, no longer theater, no longer all the fun, cool language programs. And I'd be like, what young family is ever going to come here, right? And so what the question that I have when I think about this sort of young homesteader thing in rural America, broadband is a gateway, it's a key, but it is, it's nothing that you can't get in Washington, D.C. It's nothing that you can't get in Brooklyn or Queens. So that's essential, but it's only part of what we have to think. Years ago, Clarkson did try to develop kind of a telecommuter recruiting thing into the park. It unraveled in ways that it was really a misfire, and I wish that they hadn't sort of spoiled I wish that they'd left that alone until somebody could really come in and do it well. Because this is again where I want somebody super thoughtful, not to just open a building and start doing it. I want them to think about it. How would you go and choose 5 communities in the park that still have the basic human infrastructure to attract people like what we're talking about, right? It can't be someplace where you can't go get a beer. It can't be someplace where, you can't go walk downtown and see other people. It has to be a place where people, and so those places could be part of a really interesting experiment, right? And of course the broadband piece would be right at the center of it. Yes, you're working in your home office, and then when it's time to go on a break, here's all this other cool stuff that's going to happen to you. And the cool thing about that kind of experiment would be that we cannot, and do not need to attract that many people. I mean, think about Saranac Lake, for example. If Saranac Lake, which already has most of this human infrastructure, could solve its housing problem to a substantial degree, to where there's affordable places for young people to come by in, and let's say that you could, over the course of the next 5 years, let's say that you could attract 50 young families out of America, right? That's 50 more kids in the school, which when you look at the demographic decline, even of a school district like Saranac Lake, which is an awesome, successful school district by the park standards, 50 kids would really help. You don't need to move the moon here. You just need to tweak the needle enough to matter. So broadband, yes, but I think the evidence from my reporting is now clear that broadband it just gets you into the game. You have to think much more nuancedly about what the rest of that would be like.
Can I take the one last question back here?
Sure.
So I have 1,000 questions for you, Brian, but it would be remiss if we did not ask you about all of this money that's coming into New York State for the opioid crisis. And you're the expert on that, so can you just talk to us a little bit about what's happening nationwide, New York statewide, and our beloved Adirondacks?
I have to talk about drugs at some point today. That's what. So this is really. I'm working on this story right now. There is this enormous, terrible problem. This addiction crisis. Let me say, I hope COVID is going to continue to wane. I'm going to all of us, let's just do a quick thing. And what that will mean is that within maybe even 6 months, drug overdose deaths will surpass, and then surpassed by a lot, COVID deaths. And already that is true now for everybody if you exclude the elderly. So if you set aside, which I don't mean to be mean to the elderly, I'm getting into that territory myself, but already if you set aside, say, people 50 plus, drugs are already killing more people. And so what's happening now, and this is good, is that we're on the verge of this huge infusion of cash into the treatment system. Part of it is, I think Congress will allocate a big chunk of money. They're talking about $10 billion. Part of it is these big settlements with corporations that got involved in the opioid business. They're either just paying to get out from under the legal liability, or courts are making them pay. And that's going to amount to tens of billions more that's going to be dispersed around the country. And some of that is now beginning to arrive here in New York. The Attorney General, Letitia James, has been out on this kind of tour where she's been sort of distributing pockets of money to different people. And so the question is, where is that money going to go? What is it going to do? And will it help? And here's what my reporting suggests so far. The drug treatment industry is a nightmare, and it's super unscientific, and it's super... People talk about drug treatment sort of the way, this analogy's been used to me before, that drug treatment is sort of the way cancer treatment was, say, in the 1950s. It's still that level of like, what the heck do we do? And then layered on top of that, there's a whole lot of sort of weird cultural stuff, that churches are involved and philosophical groups are involved. And so while there's a lot of increasingly good science about how to treat people with addiction, there are also a ton of people who are in it from back in the old days when there wasn't much science. And so that complicates the narrative. And then on top of that, there's a huge for-profit treatment industry. And a lot of that is, and they tell me this, I talk to people who run these clinics, a lot of it's just shysters and thieves that are just wrecking people's lives. They take them in, they charge them exorbitant amounts of money, and they don't do much healing. So the question is, now that this money is starting to arrive, where is it going to go? Who's going to get it? And is it going to reach people with addiction and help them? And I really, really worry that a huge amount of it is going to be wasted. I do think that, unlike the cigarette tobacco settlement, I do think more of it is earmarked for healthcare. More of it is earmarked for good science. More of it is earmarked for things that will at least get people some level of care. So I think it's going to help. But there are really, this is a weird thing to say, but it's almost like there's this bubble of cash moving toward a system that on many levels is not yet quite adequately prepared to uptake it and to use it very efficiently and carefully. So this is one of the things that I'm in the process of reporting on, trying to understand better how that might work. I will say, this doesn't get talked about enough, including in my own reporting. The healthcare industry that we all use, even if we don't experience addiction in our lives or in our families' lives, the healthcare system is getting better at just accepting that this is a health issue. So increasingly, emergency rooms and doctors and dentists and others who are involved. And so some of the money could simply go to help us with, Adirondack Medical Center or, these kinds of programs that just people need to go to their doctor and get good health care for their addiction. So my hope is that a lot of it will go there. But I am really worried about this, and I worry about it because of what I said at the beginning. So many people are dying, and it's really immediate. And so this money needs to get as efficiently as possible to the very programs that will keep people alive long enough to get into recovery. It is a scary situation, and our society, boy, addiction is such a mess for our society. I mean, it is really tough. I mean, we have people in prison that they're a captive audience and they're not getting good drug treatment. We're having people who are leaving prison, being sent home, who we know have addiction issues. And we have this moment when we can intervene. There's this huge, I don't have the numbers in my head, but this huge percentage of prison inmates who die within 3 months of leaving prison because they're re-entering the drug ecology that they left years ago. And so we got to get better at this. The money will help. I think the money will truly help. But there's definitely a problem in this antiquated system that we've got to get ahead of really fast. So, Scott, thank you. And thanks to all of you very much.